Welcome to class number 2 on communication. I'm Alan Johnson. I'm the social worker in our program. I work with Suzanne. I'm 3 days a week, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. Normally I'm in the office on Tuesdays, and same phone number and same contact information. So I'm going to talk to you today about communication. And the thing that I'd like to emphasize in the beginning is that in our third section on behavior is actually a form of communication. And we're going to talk more about behavior as a communication in session number 3. So this is session number 2. And the sad part of the story with dementia is that all the dementias are a progressive condition. That is, that over time they're going to get worse. And unfortunately, when the disease progresses and people begin to demonstrate symptoms of their dementia, one of the main things that will be a signal of that will be their ability to communicate. And so communication happens in 2 directions. We try to communicate to our loved ones in speech and many other forms of communication, gestures and proximity. And communication has to come from the person who has dementia to us as well. And so there's a lot of opportunity for there to be a breakdown in the communication as that happens. So I am going to talk a lot about some of the things that will help you as a family member, as a caregiver to a person with dementia, because we work with literally thousands of families that have gone before you. And we'd like for you to benefit from their accomplishments and their tricks of the trade, if you will, as part of the program that we want to surround you with. There's a lot of our program that you should take advantage of. The educational forum that we're doing right now is only a part of that. So we'd like to also see you do some care planning with us as a family and join our support groups where appropriate, and let us know if we can be available to you by phone. So in your struggles, really, to communicate going forward, I think we'd start talking about, first of all, listening. It seems so simple that we would, in a very long-term relationship, get very used to being able to listen to our loved one. But there may actually be a time where your listening has to become a little bit more active, where listening becomes more of a challenge for you as the caregiver, for us as caregivers. Sometimes we're going to have to listen for the words that are behind the words that are being spoken. And so there's a way to actively listen to people with dementia that can be helpful, but sometimes we're not always used to it, and we tend to just assume that we listen well because we know them so well and we rely on our relationship. We've been together for so long, of course I can listen to the issues. But I'm going to suggest that you stop and consider new ways of being able to listen, to be able to look at the person who's speaking, to be able to kind of think about what they're trying to say or what they might be unable to say or express. And through your listening skills, you might be able to get a better sense of what's going on. There are often in communications nonverbal cues of expression in either direction, even though we're in the same. What's important, I think, is that you be in the same room for the interaction, what I'm trying to say. So listening might have been very easy to do in your household if you were in one room or you wanted to shout a message to the person. Oh, can you bring in, my sweater, or, dinner will be shortly. But it's more and more important in dementia that you be in the same room with the person who you're trying to communicate with, especially, I want to say, in listening, so that you can read some of the nonverbal cues. In all of your communicating, I think it's helpful if you start to pay attention to your tone of voice as much as the volume that you're speaking with, because our bodies have a whole language of their own in presentation, and sometimes what's visual is just as important, if not more important, than the words that we're using. So it's possible for you to demonstrate in a more warm and caring manner if the person can see you. So there's so much more to communicating than the words being stated or heard. There's the use of gestures, and I'm going to use that gesture right now to actually include Suzanne in our conversation about communication, because Suzanne is here and available to us, and I'd like to see if we can't have a little bit of discussion for you on communication. Okay, so thank you for joining us, Suzanne. So this is Suzanne, who you already know from the first session, and Suzanne and I have been working together for the last 7 years, and Suzanne's a nurse and I'm a social worker, and we are basically the whole program. So Suzanne, would you help us talk a little bit more about some of the communication, non-verbal communications?
Well, I would say, I do want to say that wouldn't you find that people that call, they start telling us that there's a problem, and when we drill down, it often is how they're communicating with their family member or their inability to communicate. So the point you were making just before I joined you was the importance of using gestures. Mm-hmm. And if you remember from the first video on the brain, that language is the first thing to go. And so if you can somehow minimize your use of language, shorten your sentences and avoid complex compound sentences, and add in nonverbal cues at the same time, your family member can better understand what it is that you are trying to express, and they can then accomplish that. Like, do you want to stand or do you want to sit? Do you want something to eat? So that's where we were going with that.
So let me just say something about that as well to emphasize the fact that for many people listening to this video, they're gonna think, well, that's ridiculous because I've had a relationship with this person my whole life. We know how to communicate. This is for someone else. And I just want to say that over time, even in very long-term relationships, that we develop a certain rhythm of communicating, a certain normal way of speaking or communicating. Mm-hmm. And that's the thing that has to get reevaluated, that you as the caregiver really has to take some time and start to analyze or review or reconsider the words that you're using, the rhythm with which you're speaking, and some of the content. For example, it might be very normal for us as a married couple, for example, for me to say to you as a person with dementia, well, will you go upstairs and get the red sweater off the bed and bring that down for me because I'm a little chilly? It's like a chain of requests. And while that's would be perhaps a normal way of communicating, in the presence of dementia, that's way too much information for the person to retain, and so they're going to get upstairs and say, "No, is it the blue sweater, or was it the red jacket, or So we have to really consider the fact that you have a powerful relationship with the person, but that the communication has to change in ways that you really are not recognizing. And it's probably leading to missing each other at times because, again, remember that communication is happening in both directions. So there's a lot of opportunity there for missing each other. So just use that.
And there's so many points in what you said and beyond communication, but your entire relationship with your family member is changing. And just by virtue of the fact we're now calling you a caregiver versus a spouse. You may be a spouse, you may be an adult child, you may be a friend, but you're now a caregiver. And so in that relationship, it's important that you understand the needs of the person you're caring for and that those needs have changed. Otherwise, you're going to go down a rabbit hole that is going to become very difficult.
Sure. I'll take the lead and say I want to make some suggestions that it's probably going to be helpful if you slow down the conversation, if you start to choose your words a little bit more carefully, if you literally practice and say one word at a time, which seems ridiculous to do in normal conversation, but especially if you're trying to make a point, that it helps to slow down the whole process. I think an exercise that I have learned that seems ridiculous to do but can be very helpful is to stand in front of a mirror and talk to yourself a little bit in the mirror and just see how you are coming across and what kinds of, or a recording like this, watch a recording of yourself.
Also by virtue of the fact that in dementia, in almost all the dementias, there's short-term memory loss. So if you're speaking the way we're speaking today, the individual you're speaking to can't keep track of what you're saying. So, Alan's point of one statement at a time, the other point you made earlier that I wanted to expound on was, or expand on, is if your family member's sitting in the living room and you're in the kitchen, and you say, "What do you want for dinner, honey?" Or dad or mom, and they don't respond, that's because the visual cue for dinner is not in the room where they are. So again, you've got to break this down into almost sequential steps. You go over to your family member, you say, "Come with me." You're now in the kitchen. Can you have a seat? Or would you have a seat? Then you say, "What would you like for dinner?" Or "What would you like for lunch?" And offer, perhaps two choices. Generally, and I hear this from my caregivers that we work with, they always say, "Oh, I'll have what you're having," because in their mind, they can't visualize a tuna fish sandwich versus a ham sandwich. So, if you want to show them or if you know what they like, that's fine. But when Alan said earlier that all behaviors are a form of communication, oftentimes when we deal with agitation, and we're going to do a whole segment on behaviors in the next session, it's because you're communicating in a way that they can't understand you and they get frustrated. And there's no way to release that frustration except by becoming overly anxious or mad at you.
So to that point, I want to suggest as well that people do something that seems abnormal, maybe even, and that is to practice more having individual conversations for the sake of having a conversation. I think it's very nice for the person with dementia to have you as a caregiver come and just pay attention to what they have to say or pay attention to them. And I like the idea of having small mini talks, if you will, for no particular reason other than to practice the communication or to let the person with dementia know that you really care about them and that you're listening to them. Throughout the day, they may have quite different abilities to communicate. In the morning, better, maybe less so while sundowning in the afternoon. And so if you can spread out throughout the day a couple of little talks, just for no particular reason, to just be able to say, "Oh, so how are you doing? And I want to hear how your day is going and how are you feeling? And is there anything that's going on that we should talk about, or I wanted to talk about this or that, or whatever. It can have a really grounding impact, I think, on the person with dementia to just be like, oh, you care about me. Oh, we're communicating well, and you get a little better at communicating.
One thing I hear from my family members a lot, and I wonder if you hear this as well, is the fact that they feel very lonely within the relationship, particularly if it's a long-term marriage or a short-term marriage, but they feel lonely that their family member with dementia does not or doesn't seem to be able to initiate conversation. And is that something that you hear as well?
I do, especially, I think that very often we're leaving the person with dementia behind in the dust, if you will. We're going at 100 miles an hour at our normal speed, thanks to caffeine or whatever is motivating us through the day, and we've left our person with dementia in the dust, in the maybe 25 mile an hour zone, and so it is difficult for them to keep up or to, of course, remember what's just happened. And so any small techniques that you can use to slow down and to meet the person with dementia more where they're at instead of asking them to come to where you are. It's a normal thing. I think it's quite normal for us to try to encourage the person with dementia to strive, to get up to speed, to do better. And I think we're really asking the impossible in some ways, especially when it comes to communication techniques. They are where they're at, and they're not really going to learn new things or get better. I don't mean to be insulting to people with dementia in any way, but I think it's where the accommodating can happen is we as caregivers can do some adjusting.
So, in one of the segments here, we do mention that only 10% of our communication is actually represented by the words we say, 30% by the sounds, and 60% from our body language. So, for many people, that concept is new. They think the words they say are the most important facet of communicating, but it actually isn't. And for somebody, if you have even primary progressive aphasia, frontal lobe dementia, and you can't speak at all, and there needs to be some connection made, sitting with your family member and just holding hands, and the palm of the hand is one of the more sensitive areas of the body. So if you go to shake someone's hand, you would shake their hand, and normally you let go. But in the hand on hand, you shake the hand and then you wrap your thumb around and you just sit there like this. In this way, it offers a connection that doesn't have to be verbal, but can help to de-escalate any anxiety that your family member may have because they can't verbally communicate with you, and they know you're there. They know you're present.
So that was really good. Let's do it again, just because it felt really good.
So you go to shake the hand, but then you wrap your fingers around the thumb, and then you turn it over so it's comfortable, and then you put your other hand on top, and you relax, and sit like that.
And you may literally have to guide them because they don't know what you're doing.
Yeah.
Right.
So if you think about an infant when they're born, and we talked about this in the first segment, that dementia is growth and development in reverse, that an infant, the grasping sensation or the grasping reflex is the first reflex a parent sees, and that speaks to the palm of the hand being one of the very sensitive areas of connection. So Great. So going back to what else we would like to tell you.
I think that it might be timely for us to just, because you mentioned a person with that seemed to have more advanced dementia, that for people who are in later stages, when people have dementia where they're unable to communicate at all, perhaps, or are really struggling to communicate in more advanced stages of a dementia, how important it is, considering communication, how important it is that we not talk about the person as if they weren't in the room. So if someone else comes in and you want to say, oh, he's having a really bad day, or he can't seem to do anything today, or he's really grumpy today, like, they can still hear you. Mm-hmm. And they may well understand a lot of what you're saying, even though they're not able to express it. They probably are able to understand more than you think they can. And so I think it's an important thing to remember to not talk about people with dementia when they're in the room. Like, just normal courtesy applies.
Yeah, absolutely.
Always give respect to people with dementia because, wow, they have good days and bad, and they have good parts of the day and bad.
So another common call that we get is people basically tearing their hair out over repetition.
Right.
And what is the advice you give to families?
So it's got to be the most irritating, the most bothersome thing for caregivers to encounter, because not only does it happen, not only does repetition happen over the course of a fairly significant amount of time, but it happens with a lot of frequency. That, oh boy, here comes this repetition cycle again. And so you can almost see it coming. And I think it's important to know behind the scenes when you hear this repetition cycle, what that means to what the person with dementia is feeling. So when you hear repetition, what does that mean the person is feeling? It's anxiety. They're feeling anxiety. So for sure. So you can be clear that, okay, here's this question again for the 4th, the 5th, the 6th time. What time is dinner? What's dinner going to be? You know, there may be variations on the question, but the repetition is there. When you start to recognize that, I think it's helpful to start to think, okay, the loved one is feeling anxiety of some kind, and they're not able to express their anxiety. They're not able to identify what it is they're particularly anxious about, but it doesn't become very helpful to just continue to answer the question 5, 6, 8, 10, 12 times, because it's not satisfying their underlying anxiety. So what's the better thing to do instead of just answering the question, yes, it's 6 o'clock, no, we're going to have roast beef or whatever? What's a better thing to do would be to address the anxiety. Gee, Suzanne.
How would you do that?
Gee, Suzanne. It seems like maybe you are feeling a little bit of anxiety, or it seems like you're really worried about dinner. And you know what? I have everything under control. I've got you here. I've got it. I'm going to take care of this. You can sit back and relax, and I'm going to take care of everything.
Well, that's a really good point, because at the core of this disease, it's our memory that grounds us to reality. So at the core of dementia, regardless of the form of dementia, the individual is feeling a disconnect with the world around them and a loss of control. So you're absolutely right that a lot of the repetition comes from feeling that and needing reassurance. Though, as when the question is now coming at you for the 3rd or 4th time, and you've written the note, you've answered the question, it's important to learn about redirection. And I think we address that in the next segment.
That's okay, we can do it again.
But I'll just say, if you're trying to prepare dinner or lunch, and they're in your space asking constantly, what are we going to have? What are we going to do? What? The distraction can simply be, here, put these dishes on the table, or help me stir the pot, or some small action that can take their mind off of the worry about the actual concern, If it's, what time is the appointment? And here again, we advise if you're going somewhere, don't tell them 2 days in advance, because they will perseverate. They're so
What does that
afraid.
mean?
Perseverate. They're going to be overly anxious and worried that they're going to miss that appointment. So it's better actually to just say, maybe a half an hour before you're going, we're going for a ride. It doesn't actually matter where you're going. And this sort of brings us to the whole concept of a fiblet.
Can you just hold 1 second
Sure.
on the fiblet? So let's get back to fiblet in just one more. I want to make one more point about when people are repeating themselves and when they're feeling anxiety, to not forget to utilize some of the techniques that we're trying to get you to use, like the hand-on-hand gesture, or being able to touch someone, or things that we take for granted in our day-to-day interactions that make us feel comfortable may not occur to us because people are familiar to us, but a hand on the shoulder or a hug, or letting them know that the anxiety that they feel is not wrong. You don't want to make their feeling wrong, but you want them to feel less of that anxiety and more comfortable. So it takes a little bit of practice, and it takes a little bit of thought ahead of time. Repetition is a thing you're going to see time and again. And so you can put some thought into it ahead of time, and even if you have to create a little list or something of things that might be comforting to the person, like you said, a task might be comforting, or having a pad or a little blankie, or
one suggestion too that I often make, and if you can start this early on in the disease process, is to get a small whiteboard. You can pick them up, at a local store for a couple of dollars, and put that somewhere where it's central in your home, in the kitchen, maybe by the landline if you have one anymore, or somewhere where they're going to see it, and maybe just write today, and 1 or 2 things that involve what the day is going to bring. And so instead of being the one that has to answer the question constantly, you can say, what does the board say? Look at the board, so that they begin to develop a pattern of behavior that will allow them, when they're feeling anxious, to go to the board. And you'll see them do it frequently because, again, short-term memory loss, but at least you don't have to be the only person that needs to respond in that situation.
Right. I think another example of that is something that I've had great success with, and many of the clients that I've worked with have said that it's wonderful, and that is having a dementia clock. And a dementia clock is a clock that it's 8.5 by 11, or it's a small computer screen size, if you will, and it says not only what time it is, but what day it is, and it says whether it's morning, afternoon, or evening, what the date is. What else does it say? The day of the week. So it's a really grounding place for a person with dementia who might say, what day is it today? Or what's the day today? Or what time is it? Or, over and over again, you can say, like you just said, well, what does the clock say? I got you this great clock. What does the clock say? Oh, it's Thursday afternoon, which is really great. And they learn at least that's another source of the same kind of information.
I wonder if Alexa would do that.
Probably. I don't have her. But
yeah, for the Amazon
or
Echo,
Siri on your iPhone.
Where honestly, there are a lot of people that don't prefer to have something like that in their home, but this might be an option where the Alexa automatically answers if the person says, what day is it? She'll pipe up. And so it just occurred to me as a...
Be prepared to hear that in the background all the time. Alexa,
Right.
What day is it? What day is it? So Suzanne, I have a question for you. You asked me a couple of questions.
Okay.
I have a question for you. And what's your advice when a person with dementia is talking about something and then all of a sudden you realize they're completely inaccurate in their reporting of the story maybe, or they start to sort of make some, I don't know if it's references from a dream or something they watched on TV, but somehow they insert
Yes.
Sections of a story into something that's not
Right.
true. So they're saying non-truths. What's your advice about how to handle that scenario?
And that happens a lot. I talked about confabulation in the first class of people sort of living in their own reality and basing their thoughts and answers on what they believe to be true. So they believe that it's true. So if you say, no, that didn't happen, then immediately your reality and their reality don't match. So somebody's got to be right and somebody's got to be wrong. So you set up a contest of will and power there, and we want to avoid that. And we want to avoid anything that might create a increased anxiety. So instead of correcting them, just say, oh, really? I didn't know that. Honestly, something very simple, and you might have to bite your tongue, but that is the way to handle that. Oh, really? I didn't know that. Would you like to tell me more? Or I'll have to look that up, or let me make a phone call. And then you can walk away from them and regain your composure. And as a matter of fact, one of the strategies that I often tell my family members, particularly on repetition, is when they can't deal with it anymore, to say, excuse me, I have to go to the bathroom, and close the door. Because in most scenarios in life, nobody asks you, why are you going to the bathroom? So that way, give it 5 to 7 minutes and you can reappear, and it's as if the conversation never happened. So that's another little tip that we can give you.
So one of the things that I hear you saying, and something that I think is helpful for caregivers to bring home from this, is kind of the keystone bumper sticker principle in dementia care is to stop arguing with people with dementia. There's no longer really any logic and any benefit in arguing the point, whatever it may be, with a person with dementia. It's only going to end up, you'll never win an argument with a person with dementia, is what I like to say, is that if you win the argument, you lose. If you lose the argument, you lose. So if you find yourself, like you just described, in an adversarial kind of discussion, let them win. Just back away from it. There's no longer any, save the arguments for people who don't have dementia so that we can argue about all sorts of things like politics. But so it's really great, that part of your advice about, if you find yourself,
It's
let them have the fantasy.
This is directed to you, the caregiver, because we understand how difficult it is to recognize your family member now has a disease that you can't do anything about. And because of that, one is constantly trying to recenter them and reorient them to the reality that we live in. And as Alan just said, okay, so you finally get them to admit, yes, this is a blue sweater and not a red sweater, but 5 minutes later it's going to happen again. So it's a waste of your energy, and your energy is better put in other places. And so we're here to help you with that. We're here to support you on that journey and help you figure out strategies. And you can really tell between the two of us, one with a nursing psychiatric background and Alan with a social work background, how we sort of approach it as a team of how we can best serve our clients, which are you, the caregiver.
So I want to share another strategy for those difficult interactions where the communication has gone awry, or somehow or another the story has taken off and has become a fantasy more than a reality. And something that I find that works really well is using humor. Rather than arguing the point, it's so much more pleasant and so much easier if you can just laugh at the ridiculousness with which we are living with dementia in our house. I mean, if you can sort of laugh about things, or if you can get the person to start to laugh about things, then they're off the hook. So often they're able to just say, "Oh, that's right. I forgot,"
Yeah.
or "I'm mixing apples and oranges," and there's that silly memory problem of mine again. And it doesn't. They don't have to dwell on it as being an illness or a disease or a dysfunction. It's just like, oh, and it is funny if you look for the humor, not sarcasm, because sarcasm is really kind of abstract thinking humor, and it takes. That abstract thinking is now gone from the people with dementia. But just making, how we are silly as humans and how funny that can be, it really adds a lot of pleasure to your day-to-day interactions with people with dementia. So it's a good use of humor is a good way to reset the clock or reset the tone. And dementia is full of really funny things if you look for it. So, so that.
Okay. So...
We're now going to talk.
What doesn't work?
Were you? 43. Okay. Right. Okay. So that's sort of where I just was headed. Not to criticize or demean or get in an argument with a person with dementia. No finger pointing. No trying to teach the old dog new tricks, if you will, because while that sounds a little bit insulting, we have to recognize that people with dementia are not able to learn new things, at least the way that they used to, or the way that you and I can as caregivers. So we have to kind of step back a little bit and realize that let that be a truth, that they can't learn new things, and don't criticize them for that or demean them. Just know that to be true and move on to things that they can deal with, like maybe an insult. What do we do about insults? You want to take insult?
Well,
you're no good. What are you doing? How good are you?
That's a good point. Well, not the insult, but that it just brought to mind that it is, and everybody's situation is different. Some people, some couples, some adult children with their parents, they don't necessarily have any behavioral issues and they sort of breeze through. Unfortunately, they still have memory loss, but there's not a lot of discussion. And then there are others who get very indignant that, they believe you said this and you're being accused constantly as a caregiver, constantly of doing, manipulating the scene behind their backs. And we get those calls a lot too. How do you manage that? And that's actually a whole discussion in the behavioral section. But if you have a family member that is constantly accusing you, that is another scenario where you're going to need outside support, either from us or from a therapist, to help you with that, because we know you're doing the very best you can as a caregiver trying to make this work. But it's just a perception thing, and the brain, being the organ of perception, is skewed in your family member. And so when they're insulting you, you can't take it personally, but you will. So there are other kinds of therapy that you may need for support. So just know that.
It's a lot to handle, to be interacting on a regular basis, especially if there are only two of you in the house, where you're being insulted, or you're trying really hard not to turn things into an argument or win the battle. It's very difficult, especially when you've been together for a really long time, and where you've enjoyed maybe arguments and debates, and it's really hard for a lot of people to just step back and let the person with dementia win. Let them have their way. Let them. It is extremely liberating, though, going forward, to not have to argue anymore. If you can kind of think about not having arguments anymore, it can help your day look a little brighter, because it takes a lot of effort, a lot of energy to hold the truth. It's no longer important for reality, for the person with dementia to have to admit to what reality is, because it will change in 5 minutes. And so,
and so as the receiver or the caregiver of the conversation, if you don't engage, then there's no conversation, because there's nobody to banter with. Yes, of course you're being accused, and you will have to know that you know it's part of the disease and not the truth, but it doesn't it's not important for you to tell your family member that. You have to own that and keep it within your heart and be able to move forward. So that's why therapy and support groups can work, so that you can release in that an appropriate setting, rather than you can't internalize that energy without releasing it. You've got to find another way to release it, but you can't release it with your family member and expect a good outcome. So
here's another thing that really doesn't work, and I'm gonna use the example that you used when you were talking about asking your loved one about lunch. Oh, what would you like to have for lunch?
Okay.
I think really it rolls off the tongue so easily. Oh, and you're looking for collaboration and how you used to be with the other person, but really asking a person with dementia what do you want for lunch is like a no-win situation, because I don't know, there's too many choices. It's like being in a restaurant and looking at a menu. You'll notice that people are not too quick at making decisions looking at a menu in a restaurant, because by the time they get to the third item, they've forgotten what the first item is on the menu, and it takes so much of the pleasure out of being in a restaurant out of it. So rather than saying to them, so what would you like for lunch? It might be quicker and easier and have less friction if you just say, so what's on the menu today is chicken or fish, or do you want A or B, or limit the choices to multiple choice rather than open-ended questions. So
agreed.
Yeah.
Now, what is your advice, or not even your advice, but one of the most common phrases that we hear, and I actually call it the mantra of people with dementia, is I want to go home. I want to go home. They could be home and they want to go home. So tell us, or tell the viewers about your experience with
Okay,
this.
sure. I'm gonna describe it. Several times in support groups, I've heard people have come to the point where they've moved their loved one into a assisted living facility, and so they've tried to make that move as smooth as possible. They have done so much to make the room look like their home. They've moved in, old furniture and their favorite lamp and they've done everything they could possibly do to make their loved one feel comfortable in the new assisted living facility, only to find the first time that they go to visit them, what do they hear but, I want to go home. And so it's really devastating. And, they've just spent, so much money trying to make the person feel comfortable. What it doesn't mean in the setting of dementia, what I want to go home doesn't mean is that the person literally wants to be in the home where they think is home. It's not so much a place that they want when they say, I want to go home. It's a time, or it's a frame of mind. It's that feeling that we can all relate to because we've all felt it before, but we just don't have a really good word in the English language for having been on vacation a little bit too long, or that desire to okay, I've had enough of this. I want to get back to my life. And what I think people with dementia are expressing when they say I want to go home is they're saying basically that they want to go back to a time, not so much a place, but a time where they felt whole, where they felt they were able to access their memory properly. And so I think what they're really saying is, I don't want to have dementia anymore when they say I want to go home. But if you take them for their word and say, okay, well, we're going to get in the car then, and we're going to go to the home, this is your home for the last 20 years, but if you want to go home to the house where you grew up, come on, we'll get in the car and get there. If they get there, that's not what they want. It's not going to satisfy them. So it is a lamenting, if you will, of a time gone by.
Well, and I also, the core of what I had said earlier about the memory is what connects us to the world around us, and without that, we don't feel safe. And our homes are the one place we can all go and pull the covers over our head and no one's going to bother us. So I want to go home is, can come up, as I said, when you're home. It can come up when you've place someone in an assisted living or a skilled nursing facility. It literally comes up frequently, and it's probably the only theme that in this disease you hear across the board from every family.
Always.
Always. So it's important, if you are considering placing your family member in a facility where they can live safely, that you understand this in advance so that you don't feel guilty, because inevitably the emotional trauma to yourself over placing your family member after you've promised that you wouldn't do that is overwhelming.
I want to add too that you'll hear it from people who are not only in their home, but you'll hear it. Of course, you'll hear it if a person's in a hospital or if they're in you'll hear, I want to go home, when they're actually in their own home, which means that it isn't a place. It's not the physical location. So
yeah, they're not recognizing their surrounding, or sometimes even I've had family members who think they're living in a rental home.
Yeah.
Like, who owns this home? I want to go home.
Yeah.
And so there are some strategies that you can utilize. One is these are things that actually can work. If you're hearing this repeatedly, you can say, okay, let me finish what I'm doing, and hope that the short-term memory loss kicks in and they forget, because really they just want to be heard. They want to be heard and they want to be validated. So if you say, okay, I hear you, then you're doing both of that, and you don't need to actually physically leave your home. The second strategy, and this has worked for some family members, where they go out the back door and they walk around to the front door and they say,
here we are.
We're home, and that stops that. Or they get in the car and they drive around the block and isn't it great to be home? So, again, for the person with the dementia, they are looking for reassurance. They are looking for validation, and you're the only person that can give it to them. Normally, though, it will come as somewhat of a surprise to you. You're doing your daily routine.
I think there's nothing more devastating for a caregiver than to hear that phrase. Maybe more devastating might be that I'm in terrible pain, but I think that is what they're saying on some level. They're saying, like, I'm not okay. Mm-hmm. And it is incredibly difficult for a caregiver to hear their loved one say, oh, I want to go home, and I want to feel better, or I don't want to be here. Because we can't satisfy that. There's almost nothing we can do. But there are some things you can do. Yeah. There are some things. And what you're saying, the distraction, or the listening to it, or the drawing them out a little bit. Really? You want to go home? Like, what is it about home that you miss? Like, what do you mean by that? It's frightening, I think, for caregivers to follow the person with dementia down that pathway. But you might want to consider doing that at times and say, well, okay, so tell me about home. What are you talking about? Tell me more about that. Is it the home
that house, that gray house?
Really? You mean the one that's in Barnstable? That house where you grew up?
Oh, no. I don't know where it is. It's gray, and my cat is there.
Yeah. Okay. So what is it about that home that you would like to?
Well, no one's
like?
feeding the cat.
Ah, so you're worried about the cat.
Yes.
Yes.
How do we feed the cat? It's about finding the reason why they want to go home.
Yeah.
Okay, so we say it's because they feel unsafe, but then it could be something else. It could just be something very simple that you need to validate. So it could be, okay, and they need to feel connected. So if you help them reminisce to the point of connecting, like, what was your favorite room there?
Yeah.
My pink bedroom, and I just want to go there. Oh, you like pink, what is it about pink, or is it the cat, or some of these things it requires listening.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah. It's often about my mom and my mom's cooking, or whatever it might be, and you can just get them to embellish on that and talk more about the flavors or the smells.
But it does require you as the caregiver to stop what you're doing.
Yeah.
And look them in the eye and give them full attention. Because if you want this situation to not turn into a full-blown case of anxiety or agitation, you will need to respond. And it doesn't mean you have to respond by going home. You just need to respond by exploring a little bit. So one of the things that one of the techniques that I utilize is, it catches you by surprise. So you can immediately be the mirror and go, oh, you want to go home? So it helps you regain your composure and helps you as the caregiver focus on the moment. And of course they're going to say, yes, I want to go home, but then you can say, is there a reason, or which home do you want to go to? Now, there have been family members that have taken their person with dementia to the old homestead, thinking that will finally satisfy this constant repetition, only to get there and hear, I want to go home. So it just validates to us that it's not a place, that it's an emotion, and we need to explore what it is that they're saying.
And so after listening, so the message is listen, change your communication style to a place where you're hearing and listening intensely to the person periodically, even if they're talking about gibberish or nonsensical things, but validating what they have to say. We want to give you another technique or another tool to use that is time to talk about and validate, and that is using less than truths, using what we might call fiblets or half-truths or white lies or exaggerations or whatever term you want to use about it.
Well, the New York Times actually called it compassionate deception.
There we go.
So there was a huge article like 2 years ago in New Yorker, I shouldn't say New York Times, New Yorker magazine on compassionate deception. So whatever terminology you feel comfortable with, the bottom line is it's all the same in terms of how we're going to explain utilizing the little white lie, or what we prefer to call the fiblet.
It just seems so wrong in so many relationships that have been based on years and years of trust and honesty and the knowledge that you could rely on one another. It just seems wrong on some level at some point for you as the caregiver to start to tell less than the truth. But the truth sometimes is too much for the person with dementia to handle. And so it's your job as the caregiver to start to determine how much truth they can handle, or begin to use a little bit of compassionate deception and let them rest easily on the trust that they'll feel, the result of the lifetime of trust and honesty. So for you to be able to say, I'll get to that in a minute, or hold on, is really just a little white lie. And if you're taking advantage of short-term memory loss and hoping they're going to forget about it, and promising them that, oh, sure, we can do that, or I'll have that for you, or let me take care of that for you, it allows them to go back to a place of being calm and happy. And how is that wrong? No one's advocating here that you start to become deceptive or manipulative, but rather, I guess it is a little bit manipulative, but it's with a good end that we're looking.
You're using the tool to minimize anxiety rather than for, deception or
ill gains.
Ill gains, well put. So it literally takes, I think, 6 months to really feel comfortable utilizing the Fiblet, because people do feel that they're dishonest. Once you start learning that it's a tool in your toolbox and it actually works, then it allows you a little more flexibility in how you communicate with your family member. And you can make sure you get through the day a little bit easier. And that's really what it's about. How do we get through today? Never mind tomorrow.
We give you permission to use small white lies or fiblets or compassionate, what is it?
Compassionate deception.
Deception.
I know. And
it doesn't feel right, does it?
No.
Okay.
And we've done repetition.
Yep. And so...
taking care of yourself.
I think in closing that we should start to emphasize for you as caregivers that it is such an overwhelming role that you're in, and that I think there's a helpful sort of mathematical equation that I like to quote, that it's as certain as a mathematical equation that one single person cannot possibly care for another person who has dementia all by themselves. It's just not physically possible. And so you're going to need help. You're going to need information. You're going to need to rally the troops, to call on professionals, to call on family members, neighbors, to become really resourceful, to begin to make sure that you don't burn out as a caregiver, because there's a terrible statistic out there where a very high percentage, we'll just leave it at some vague number, of caregivers end up burning out and not being able to continue to care for their loved one. And burnout is a terrible thing. So to prevent that from happening, taking care of yourself is a really important thing. That just sounds so easy to say and really hard to do when, you've got a million things to do and nobody to help.
Well, it's also about building your care team, so you're absolutely right. No one can do it alone. And where we are today, which is in still the post-COVID but COVID scenario, help is not as readily available in the home setting as it used to be, nor in facility settings. So it's becoming somewhat of a challenge for a lot of families to piecemeal a plan together. But it's like putting together a puzzle, and we can help you do that. Sit down and figure out the components of your care team, and of course a support group is also really helpful in learning what's available in the community, because we've been doing this a long time, both of us, but we don't always have the answers that you might need, and somebody else's strategies might work, and you hear that in a group setting.
Yeah, I think it's helpful really to start thinking about really specific things that you could use some help with as a caregiver. It might be a friendly visit from a neighbor, a former colleague, a relative that may live nearby but you haven't had a lot of contact with, that you can reconnect with. And it helps to have a calendar. It helps to have specific times that you might want to request some help with. It helps to take care of your physical well-being as well as your mental well-being, to get the right balance of nutrition and sleep and rest and exercise and all of the things that we should be doing that, okay,
Yeah.
who has time for all of that as well? But it's an investment in, I think one of the things that can motivate people to do well by themselves as caregivers is to think about, if you're not there, what's going to happen? What's the backup plan? If you're not there to give the care, what's going to happen to the person with dementia? So it's time to really step up your
Because
game.
your family member can only stay home as long as you're healthy and in the house, able to care for them. If that equation changes, what is Plan B?
Right.
And that's also important to know. So, thank you for watching us today.
Very exciting. The next section on behavior, I think you're going to get a lot out of that, and we'll be back to tell you about that.